My daughter's husband dismissed my cooking as ethnic nonsense and bragged about his culinary school training. Today he's worth millions serving authentic Italian cuisine that he learned by secretly copying my recipes, but there's one dish he can never replicate without my help. The insult came during our traditional Sunday dinner, delivered with the casual cruelty that only family members can master. I was standing at my kitchen counter, carefully ladling my grandmother's marinara sauce over fresh pasta, when Tony decided to share his professional opinion about my primitive cooking methods. "Betty, you know what your problem is?" he announced, gesturing with his wine glass toward my collection of handwritten recipe cards that had been passed down through 4 generations of Italian women. "You're stuck in the old country mentality. This ethnic nonsense might have been impressive in 1920, but modern cuisine has evolved beyond peasant food." I set down the ladle slowly, feeling the familiar weight of condescension that had become Tony's signature contribution to our family gatherings. My daughter Maria sat beside him, her eyes focused on her plate, unwilling to defend the recipes that had nourished her throughout her childhood. "These recipes have been in our family for over a century, Tony. They've fed 4 generations. Exactly my point," he continued with the smugness of someone who'd spent 3 years at culinary school and thought it made him an expert on Italian culture. "Your great-grandmother was probably illiterate, writing down whatever she could remember from some village in Sicily. Real Italian cuisine is sophisticated, refined. It requires proper training to understand the science behind cooking." The science behind cooking. As if my great-grandmother Lucia, who had fed a family of 8 through the Great Depression with nothing but flour, tomatoes and whatever vegetables she could grow in her tiny backyard garden, hadn't understood the science of making something from nothing. But what Tony said next was what really revealed his ignorance. "I mean, look at these cards," he said, picking up my grandmother's recipe for osso buco, with the same reverence he might show a piece of litter. "No measurements, no cooking times, no temperature specifications. Just a pinch of this, and cook until it feels right. How is anyone supposed to replicate authentic results with instructions like that?" Maria finally found her voice, though it was weak and apologetic. "Tony, Mom's food is really good. People always compliment her cooking." "Maria, sweetie, your palate has been conditioned by growing up with this style of cooking. But when you taste real Italian cuisine, the kind they serve in actual restaurants with trained chefs, you'll understand the difference between sentimental comfort food and authentic culinary artistry." I looked at this man who had married my daughter 3 years earlier, who had been eating my Sunday dinners every week since their engagement, who had never once failed to ask for seconds of the ethnic nonsense he was now dismissing as inferior to his culinary school education. "Tony, have you ever been to Italy?" His face flushed slightly. "That's not the point, Betty. I've studied Italian cuisine extensively. I've learned proper techniques from certified instructors who've trained in the finest kitchens in America." America, not Italy. Not from Italian grandmothers who had learned their techniques from their grandmothers. From American culinary schools that taught standardized versions of recipes that had been simplified and modified for mass production. "And what do you plan to do with this extensive education?" I asked, genuinely curious about his career ambitions. "Actually, I've been meaning to tell you both. I'm opening my own restaurant. Modern Italian cuisine, with an emphasis on authentic flavors and proper technique." But what he said next was what would eventually cost him everything. "I'm going to show this city what real Italian food tastes like. Not the heavy, outdated dishes that Italian Americans have been serving for decades. Clean flavors, precise presentation, sophisticated combinations that respect the true spirit of Italian cuisine." The true spirit of Italian cuisine. From a man who had never set foot in Italy, who had learned his techniques from textbooks and YouTube videos, who thought that authentic meant using expensive ingredients and fancy plating techniques.
"And where will you get your recipes?"
I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "I'll be developing my own, of course, based on classical techniques and modern interpretations of traditional dishes. Nothing like," he gestured dismissively toward my recipe cards, "these amateur attempts at preserving whatever your ancestors could remember." Amateur attempts. My great-grandmother, Lucia, had been cooking professionally since she was 12 years old, first in her family's osteria in Sicily, then in the boarding house she ran in New York's Little Italy. Her recipe cards represented 70 years of professional cooking experience, refined through thousands of meals and adapted to American ingredients without losing their essential character. But Tony saw only handwritten notes in broken English. measurements that relied on intuition rather than precision, techniques that had been passed down through oral tradition rather than formal instruction. As I watched him dismiss a century of accumulated culinary wisdom, I made a decision that would change both of our lives forever. If Tony wanted to prove that his modern education was superior to my family's traditional knowledge, I was going to let him try. But I was also going to ensure that when he inevitably came begging for help, he would understand exactly what he had dismissed as ethnic nonsense. The war between tradition and arrogance was about to begin, and Tony had no idea what he was up against. 6 months after Tony's declaration of culinary superiority, Antonino's Modern Italian opened in the trendy downtown district with great fanfare and newspaper reviews that praised its innovative approach to traditional cuisine. What the critics didn't know was that I had been watching Tony's preparation process with the fascination of a scientist observing a predictable experiment. The first sign that Tony's confidence exceeded his competence came 2 weeks before his opening, when Maria called me in tears. "Mom, Tony's been testing recipes for months, but nothing tastes right. His marinara sauce is too acidic, his risotto is gummy, and his osso buco tastes like it came from a cookbook." Because it did come from a cookbook. Several cookbooks, in fact, along with online tutorials and YouTube videos featuring celebrity chefs who had never learned to cook from their grandmothers. "Maybe he needs more practice, sweetheart. Opening a restaurant is stressful." "Mom, he's been sneaking into our kitchen at night, trying to recreate your dishes. I've seen him taking pictures of your recipe cards when he thinks no one is looking." Taking pictures. The man who had dismissed my grandmother's recipes as amateur attempts was secretly documenting them because his culinary school education hadn't taught him how to make food that actually tasted good. But what Maria told me next was what confirmed my suspicions about Tony's desperation. "Last night I caught him going through your old recipe box, the one with great-grandma Lucia's original cards. He was trying to translate them, but you know how her English was. My great-grandmother had written her recipes in a mixture of Italian, broken English and her own system of abbreviations that had been developed over decades of professional cooking. The measurements were intuitive because she had learned to cook by feel, adjusting ingredients based on their quality, the weather, the preferences of her customers, and dozens of other variables that no culinary school teaches." "Did you help him translate them?" "I tried, but I don't understand them either. Remember, you never taught me to cook from those cards. You always just showed me what to do." That was the Italian way. Recipes weren't just lists of ingredients and instructions, they were living traditions that required understanding the why behind every step, the cultural context that gave meaning to each technique, the accumulated wisdom that turned simple ingredients into expressions of love and heritage. Tony had formal training, but he lacked the cultural knowledge that made Italian cooking more than just following directions. A week before his opening, I received an unexpected visitor. Tony appeared at my door on a Tuesday evening, his usual arrogance replaced by something that looked suspiciously like desperation. "Betty, I need to talk to you about something." I invited him in and made coffee, using the same espresso pot that had belonged to my grandmother, sweetening it with the same brand of sugar she had used for 60 years. "Tony, what's troubling you?" "It's the restaurant. The recipes I've developed. They're good, but they're not." He struggled to find words that wouldn't require admitting his failures. "They don't have the depth of flavor that your dishes have." Depth of flavor. The quality that comes from understanding ingredients, respecting traditions, and cooking with love rather than ego. "Perhaps you need more time to develop your technique." "Betty, I was wondering if you could share some insights about traditional cooking methods. Not your actual recipes," he added quickly, "but maybe some general principles that might help me achieve more authentic flavors." But what he was really asking was whether I would help him steal my family's culinary heritage without admitting that his expensive education had been worthless. "Tony, what kind of insights were you hoping for?" "Well, for instance, your marinara sauce has this incredible complexity that I can't replicate. I've tried different brands of tomatoes, various herbs, different cooking times, but it never tastes like yours. Because marinara sauce isn't just tomatoes and herbs. It's understanding which tomatoes work best with which herbs, how the acidity changes based on the season, why some batches need sugar while others need a splash of wine, how to layer flavors so they develop properly during cooking. Have you tried using San Marzano tomatoes?" "Of course, the best ones I can find. But your sauce has this depth. And what herbs are you using? Traditional ones? Basil, oregano, garlic, Everything the recipes call for. Everything the recipes call for. As if cooking were just about following a grocery list rather than understanding how flavors work together, how ingredients change during cooking, how techniques passed down through generations create results that can't be achieved through formal training alone. Tony, let me ask you something. When you taste my marinara sauce, what do you notice about the texture? It's smooth but not too smooth. Rich but not heavy. Complex but not overwhelming. And how do you think that texture is achieved? He was quiet for a long moment, probably realizing that he had no idea how to answer. His culinary school had taught him techniques, but it hadn't taught him to understand why those techniques worked or how to modify them based on the specific ingredients and conditions he was working with. I'm not sure, that's why I was hoping you might share some traditional methods. Traditional methods. He wanted to steal my great-grandmother's techniques without acknowledging that the ethnic nonsense he had dismissed contained knowledge that his expensive education couldn't provide. I made a decision that would determine both of our futures. Tony, I'll make you a deal. I'll teach you some traditional techniques, but only if you're willing to publicly acknowledge where you learned them. What do you mean? I mean that if you want access to my family's culinary knowledge, you need to give credit to the women who developed these recipes over generations of professional cooking. His face went through several expressions as he calculated the implications. He needed my help, but acknowledging it would require admitting that his modern approach was inferior to the primitive methods he had mocked. Betty, that seems fair. I'm sure we can work something out. But what Tony didn't know was that I had already decided exactly what kind of lesson he was going to learn about the value of traditional knowledge versus formal training. Antonino's Modern Italian opened to rave reviews and packed dining rooms, but I knew the truth behind Tony's sudden culinary success. He had spent the week before opening in my kitchen, frantically copying techniques that had taken my family generations to perfect, then presenting them to the world as his own innovative interpretations of traditional cuisine. The first review appeared in the city's premier food magazine just 2 weeks after opening. Chef Antonio Ricci brings sophisticated understanding to Italian classics, elevating familiar dishes through masterful technique and intuitive seasoning. His marinara sauce achieves a complexity rarely found outside of Italy itself. Complexity rarely found outside of Italy. The reviewer was praising my great-grandmother Lucia's 1920s recipe, filtered through 4 generations of refinement, presented by a man who had never set foot in Italy, and who had mocked those same recipes as ethnic nonsense just months earlier. But what truly revealed the scope of Tony's theft was the menu itself. Maria brought me a copy of Antonino's opening menu, her face a mixture of pride and confusion. Mom, look at this. Tony's restaurant is serving ossobuco just like yours, and the reviews say it's the best in the city. I studied the menu descriptions, recognizing dish after dish that had been copied from my family's recipe collection. Nonna's braccioli, my grandmother's exact recipe, down to the specific ratio of pine nuts to raisins in the stuffing. Traditional Sicilian caponata, my great-grandmother's original formulation, including the secret ingredient that most modern versions omitted. House-made gnocchi, with butter sage sauce, the exact technique I had taught Tony in my kitchen, including the hand-rolling method that took most people years to master. Every signature dish was stolen from my family's culinary heritage, rebranded as Tony's innovative interpretation of traditional Italian cuisine. Maria, did Tony develop these recipes himself? She was quiet for a long moment, clearly uncomfortable with the question. He said he spent months researching traditional techniques and consulting with various sources. Various sources. A diplomatic way of saying he had stolen everything from his wife's grandmother while publicly dismissing her knowledge as inferior to his formal training. But the most insulting part was how the food critics praised Tony's authentic understanding of Italian culture. The review in the newspaper's weekend section was particularly galling. Chef Ricci demonstrates the kind of intuitive grasp of Italian cuisine that can only come from deep cultural connection and years of dedicated study. His dishes achieve the perfect balance of tradition and innovation, respecting classical techniques while applying modern sensibilities. Deep cultural connection. From a man whose grandparents had come from Ireland and Poland, who had learned everything he knew about Italian cooking from textbooks and YouTube videos, and from secretly copying my family's recipes. Years of dedicated study, 3 years at culinary school, plus a few weeks stealing techniques from the woman whose knowledge he had publicly dismissed as worthless. Within 3 months, Antonino's was booked solid for 2 months in advance. Food bloggers were calling it the most authentic Italian restaurant in the city. Tony was being interviewed for cooking shows and food magazines, sharing his philosophy of respecting traditional techniques while bringing modern precision to classical recipes. But what he didn't know was that I had been carefully documenting his theft, every recipe he had copied, every technique he had learned in my kitchen, every dish he was now serving as his own creation. I had detailed records of when and how he had acquired that knowledge. More importantly, I had kept the original recipe cards that proved the true source of his innovative cuisine. The local food magazine wanted to do a feature story about Tony's success, focusing on his unique approach to Italian cooking. When the journalist called to interview me as the chef's mother-in-law, I agreed to the interview with enthusiasm. "Mrs. Romano, your son-in-law has become quite famous for his authentic Italian cuisine. You must be proud. I'm fascinated by his success. He's certainly made good use of everything he's learned about traditional cooking methods. He mentions that he studied classical techniques extensively. Did he learn any of those techniques from you?" "Oh yes, Tony spent considerable time in my kitchen learning traditional methods. In fact, most of his signature dishes are based on recipes that have been in my family for generations." The journalist's interest sharpened immediately. "Really? So his cuisine is influenced by your family's traditional recipes?" "Influenced is one way to put it. Another way would be to say that he's serving my great-grandmother's exact recipes, which he copied after spending months mocking them as ethnic nonsense and amateur attempts at authentic Italian cooking." But what I revealed next was what would change everything about Tony's carefully constructed image. I have the original recipe cards that Tony copied, including handwritten notes from my great-grandmother who ran a professional kitchen in Little Italy for 40 years. I also have recordings of Tony dismissing these same recipes as primitive and outdated before he realized they were worth millions in restaurant revenue. The journalist was quiet for a long moment. "Mrs. Romano, are you saying that your son-in-law built his restaurant's reputation on recipes he stole from your family?" "I'm saying that Tony's innovative interpretations are actually my family's traditional recipes, which he learned by secretly copying my great-grandmother's handwritten cards after publicly claiming that his culinary school education was superior to our peasant food." "And you have documentation of this?" "I have everything. The original recipes, recordings of his insults, photos of him secretly copying my family's recipe cards, and detailed notes about every technique he learned in my kitchen before presenting them as his own culinary innovations." The article that appeared the following week would destroy Tony's reputation and teach him exactly what it cost to steal from the woman whose knowledge he had dismissed as worthless. But more importantly, it would teach the entire city that authentic cuisine comes from cultural heritage and generational knowledge, not from expensive education and professional arrogance. The food magazine article hit the newsstands on a Tuesday morning with a headline that demolished Tony's reputation in 7 words: "Famous chef's authentic recipes stolen from grandmother-in-law." The piece was devastating in its thoroughness. The journalist had verified every claim I'd made, obtained copies of my great-grandmother's original recipe cards, and even hired a food historian to confirm that the dishes Tony was serving as his innovations were traditional Sicilian recipes that predated his birth by decades. But what truly destroyed Tony's credibility was the magazine's decision to print excerpts from the recordings I'd made of his insults. These direct quotes from Chef Ricci, recorded during family dinners in 2023, reveal his true attitude toward the traditional recipes he now claims as his own innovative creations. "This ethnic nonsense might have been impressive in 1920, but modern cuisine has evolved beyond peasant food. Your great-grandmother was probably illiterate, writing down whatever she could remember from some village in Sicily. Real Italian cuisine is sophisticated, refined. It requires proper training to understand the science behind cooking. I'm going to show this city what real Italian food tastes like, not the heavy, outdated dishes that Italian Americans have been serving for decades." The contrast between his recorded insults and his current menu descriptions was devastating. How could a chef claim to respect traditional Italian culture while privately dismissing it as ethnic nonsense and peasant food? But the most damaging revelation was the magazine's documentation of Tony's theft process. The article included photographs I'd taken of Tony secretly copying my recipe cards, time-stamped evidence of his late-night visits to my kitchen, and detailed comparisons between my family's original recipes and the dishes he was serving at Antonino's. The food historian they'd consulted was particularly damning. These recipes show clear evidence of generational refinement and cultural authenticity. The techniques described in Mrs. Romano's family cards represent traditional Sicilian cooking methods that take decades to master. Chef Ricci's claim to have developed these recipes independently is not credible. The response was immediate and catastrophic for Tony's business. Restaurant reservations were canceled within hours of the article's publication. Food bloggers who had praised Tony's authentic understanding of Italian culture now condemned him as a fraud who had built his reputation on stolen family recipes. The cooking show that had been planning to feature him canceled his appearance. The cookbook deal he'd been negotiating disappeared overnight. But what happened next revealed just how much Tony had underestimated the woman whose knowledge he'd stolen. 3 days after the article appeared, Tony showed up at my door at 7 in the morning, his usual arrogance replaced by desperate panic. "Betty, we need to talk. This article is destroying my business. I imagine it would be difficult to maintain credibility after being exposed as someone who steals recipes from the same family traditions he publicly mocks. Betty, please. You have to understand. When I said those things about your cooking, I was young and stupid. I didn't understand the value of traditional knowledge." Young and stupid. He was 32 years old and had been married to my daughter for 3 years. Old enough to understand that insulting someone's cultural heritage was wrong, and experienced enough to know that stealing from that same heritage was theft. "Tony, what exactly are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to help me save my restaurant. Maybe we could work together, create some kind of partnership where you get proper credit for the traditional recipes." But what he was really asking was whether I would help him clean up the mess he'd made by stealing from me. "You want me to legitimize your theft after the fact? It's not theft, Betty. It's cultural sharing. Families share recipes all the time. Families share recipes with permission and respect, Tony. They don't mock the knowledge as ethnic nonsense and then secretly copy it to build million-dollar businesses. Look, I'm willing to give you credit. We could call them Nonna Betty's traditional recipes or something like that. You could even get a percentage of the profits." A percentage of the profits. From recipes that belonged entirely to my family, stolen by a man who had dismissed them as worthless peasant food until he realized they were worth millions. "Tony, let me ask you something. When you opened Antonino's, did you tell the investors that your signature dishes were based on stolen family recipes?" His face went pale. The recipes were inspired by traditional techniques. "Did you tell them that you had learned these traditional techniques by secretly copying handwritten cards from a woman whose knowledge you had publicly dismissed as inferior to your formal training?" "Betty, you're making this sound worse than it is. I'm making it sound exactly as bad as it is. You built a business on stolen intellectual property, misrepresented the source of your knowledge to investors and customers, and committed fraud by claiming credit for work that belonged to someone else." But what I told him next was what finally made him understand the full scope of his miscalculation. "Tony, there's something you don't know about my family's recipes. The ones you copied and have been serving at your restaurant? Those aren't complete?" "What do you mean?" "I mean that my great-grandmother was a professional chef who understood the importance of protecting trade secrets. The recipe cards you copied contain the basic formulations, but they're missing crucial steps that can only be learned through hands-on instruction." The color drained from his face as he realized what I was telling him. I mean that you've been serving inferior versions of my family's recipes because you don't know the complete techniques. Your marinara sauce lacks the depth of flavor that comes from a specific layering process that isn't written on any card. Your osso buco is missing the preliminary treatment that gives the meat its characteristic texture. Your gnocchi are good, but they're not great because you don't know the final step that creates the perfect consistency. But the reviews have been positive. The reviews have been positive because your versions are better than most restaurant Italian food, which is generally terrible. But they're not as good as the complete recipes, which is why you can never quite replicate the flavors you tasted in my kitchen. Tony was staring at me with the expression of someone who was finally understanding the true scope of what he had stolen and what he had failed to steal. "Betty, please, I'll do anything to make this right. Just tell me what you want." What I wanted was for him to learn that cultural heritage isn't something you can steal, respect isn't something you can fake, and authentic cuisine comes from generations of accumulated wisdom that can't be acquired through arrogance and theft. But what I told him was something much more specific. Tony's desperation was visible in every line of his face as he sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the same recipe cards he had once dismissed as ethnic nonsense, and now knew represented the only thing that could save his dying restaurant. Betty, name your price. I'll give you whatever you want: partnership, profits, public credit. Just help me fix this situation. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the same espresso pot my grandmother had used, sweetening it with the same careful attention to proportion that had characterized 4 generations of women in my family. Tony watched every movement, probably wondering if there were secret techniques hidden in something as simple as making coffee. Tony, before we discuss any kind of arrangement, I want you to understand something about the recipes you stole. They're not stolen, Betty. I learned them from family. You copied them secretly after publicly mocking them, then presented them as your own innovations. That's the definition of theft. I walked to my kitchen counter and pulled out a wooden box that Tony had never seen before, the box containing my great-grandmother's complete recipe collection, including the professional techniques she had never written down because they were too valuable to risk having stolen. These cards that you photographed represent maybe 60% of each recipe. The remaining 40% consists of techniques, timing, and ingredient modifications that could only be learned through apprenticeship. Tony's eyes widened as he realized the implications. You mean there are more steps? I mean that my great-grandmother Lucia was a professional chef who understood the importance of protecting trade secrets. She wrote down enough information to help family members recreate basic versions of her dishes, but she kept the crucial techniques in her head and passed them down only through hands-on teaching. But what I revealed next was what truly devastated him. The marinara sauce you've been serving at Antonino's? It's missing the foundation technique that creates the characteristic depth. The osso buco lacks the preliminary meat treatment that produces the proper texture. Your gnocchi are acceptable, but they're not exceptional because you don't know the final step that transforms good pasta into transcendent pasta. But the reviews have been positive because most restaurant Italian food is mediocre. Your stolen recipes, even incomplete, are better than the generic versions most chefs serve, but they're not as good as the complete techniques, which is why you've been frustrated that your dishes never quite taste like mine. I opened the wooden box and showed him recipe cards written in my great-grandmother's hand, densely covered with notes and corrections accumulated over decades of professional cooking. These cards contained the techniques that transformed simple ingredients into the dishes that had made her boarding house famous throughout Little Italy. These are the complete recipes, Tony. The ones that include every step, every timing consideration, every ingredient modification that creates truly exceptional Italian cuisine. His hands were actually shaking as he looked at cards that represented knowledge he could never acquire through formal training or textbook study. Betty, please. I'll do anything.
Anything?
Yes. Name your terms. But what I demanded was something that would test whether Tony had learned anything about respect, humility, and the value of cultural heritage. First, you will publicly apologize for stealing my family's recipes and misrepresenting them as your own innovations. This apology will appear in the same food magazine that exposed your theft, and it will acknowledge that your restaurant's success was built on knowledge you stole from a woman whose cultural heritage you had mocked. His face went through several expressions as he calculated the professional cost of such an admission. Betty, that could destroy what's left of my reputation. Your reputation is already destroyed, Tony. The question is whether you're willing to rebuild it on a foundation of honesty and respect, rather than theft and arrogance. What else? Second, you will rename your restaurant Nonna Lucia's, in honor of my great-grandmother, whose recipes you stole. The menu will acknowledge that these are traditional family recipes passed down through generations of professional Italian cooks. But that changes everything about my brand. Your brand was built on lies, Tony. I'm giving you the opportunity to build a new brand based on truth. And third, you will work in my kitchen for 6 months, learning the complete techniques properly, understanding the cultural context that gives meaning to each dish, and demonstrating the respect for traditional knowledge that you should have shown from the beginning. But what I told him next was what made him understand this wasn't just about saving his restaurant. Tony, this isn't just about recipes or techniques. It's about understanding that cultural heritage has value, that traditional knowledge deserves respect, and that authentic cuisine comes from generations of accumulated wisdom, not from expensive education and professional arrogance. I understand. Do you? Because 6 months ago, you stood in this same kitchen and told me that my great-grandmother was probably illiterate, that her recipes were amateur attempts, that real Italian cuisine required formal training to understand. The shame on his face was visible as he remembered his own words. I was wrong. You were worse than wrong, Tony. You were disrespectful to the memory of a woman who spent 70 years perfecting techniques that you dismissed as primitive, then stole those same techniques to build a business worth millions. Betty, I want to make this right. I accept your terms.
All of them?
Yes, the public apology, the restaurant name change, the 6 months of training. I'll do whatever it takes. But what I revealed next was what would determine whether Tony truly learned the lesson I was trying to teach. There's one more condition, Tony. The most important one. What is it? You have to mean it. The apology, the respect, the acknowledgement of what you stole. It has to be genuine. Because if you're just going through the motions to save your business, you'll never understand the complete techniques anyway. I don't understand. Authentic Italian cooking isn't just about following directions, Tony. It's about understanding the love and respect that goes into every dish, the cultural pride that transforms simple ingredients into expressions of heritage and family. You can't fake that understanding, and you can't learn it from someone you don't genuinely respect. I pulled out one final recipe card, the one for my great-grandmother's legendary ragu, the sauce that had made her boarding house famous, and that no restaurant in the city had ever successfully replicated. This is the recipe you've been trying to recreate for 3 years. The one that food critics say doesn't exist anymore because modern chefs don't understand traditional techniques. Tony's eyes fixed on the card with the intensity of someone seeing a treasure map. You'll teach me this recipe? I'll teach you this recipe if, and only if, you prove that you understand the difference between stealing knowledge and earning the right to inherit it. The final test was about to begin, and this time, Tony would learn that respect and authenticity couldn't be faked, stolen, or purchased with apologies and public relations campaigns. They had to be earned through humility, dedication, and genuine understanding of the cultural heritage he had spent so much time mocking. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen watching Tony carefully layer ingredients for my great-grandmother's legendary ragu, his movements precise and respectful in a way that would have been unimaginable when this journey began. The man who had once dismissed my family's recipes as ethnic nonsense was now treating each step with the reverence of someone who had finally learned what authentic meant. The transformation hadn't been easy. The public apology he'd published in the food magazine had been painful and career-damaging, but it had also been genuine. Tony had acknowledged not just his theft, but his arrogance, his cultural insensitivity, and his failure to recognize the value of generational knowledge. I built my restaurant's reputation on recipes I stole from my wife's grandmother. The apology had read, I publicly mocked these same recipes as ethnic nonsense and peasant food, while privately copying them to create dishes I then claimed as my own innovations. I disrespected not just Miss Romano's generosity in sharing family traditions, but the memory of 4 generations of Italian women who developed these techniques through decades of professional cooking. I am deeply ashamed of my behavior and committed to making amends. The restaurant industry had been split in their response. Some praised Tony's honesty and willingness to take responsibility for his mistakes. Others saw the apology as too little, too late, coming only after he'd been publicly exposed. But the most important response had come from the Italian-American community, who had embraced his effort to properly honor traditional cooking methods. But the real change had happened during his 6 months of training in my kitchen. Tony, tell me what you're doing differently now with the sofrito. I'm letting each layer of vegetables develop its flavor completely before adding the next one. Before, I was rushing the process because I thought efficiency was more important than flavor development. And why is that important? Because the sofrito is the foundation of the sauce. If you rush the foundation, nothing you build on top of it will have the depth it needs. It had taken 3 months for Tony to understand that Italian cooking wasn't about following recipes. It was about understanding ingredients, respecting time, and allowing each component to contribute its best qualities to the final dish. What about the meat? I'm browning it in smaller batches now, making sure each piece develops a proper crust before deglazing. I used to try to do everything at once because I thought it was more professional. But I've learned that some things can't be rushed. Some things can't be rushed. It had taken Tony 4 months to truly understand that lesson, both in cooking and in earning respect. But the most important change had been in how he spoke about the recipes and techniques he was learning. Betty, I need to tell you something. When I first started copying your family's recipes, I thought I was just taking some old-fashioned formulas and improving them with modern techniques. I didn't understand that I was stealing generations of accumulated wisdom. What do you understand now? I understand that these recipes aren't just lists of ingredients and instructions. They're cultural documents that represent the lives and struggles of women who fed their families through wars, depressions, and immigrations. Every technique tells a story about adaptation, survival, and love. The depth of his understanding surprised me. 6 months earlier, Tony had seen my great-grandmother's recipe cards as primitive notes written by an illiterate peasant. Now he recognized them as sophisticated documents created by a professional chef who had perfected her techniques through decades of feeding people who depended on her skill. And what about the techniques themselves? I've learned that traditional techniques exist for reasons that aren't always obvious. The way your great-grandmother layered flavors, the timing she used for each step, the specific ingredients she chose. Every decision was based on understanding how food actually works, not just how it's supposed to work according to textbooks. Tony had spent his first month in my kitchen, frustrated by the apparent inefficiency of traditional methods. Why brown meat in small batches when you could do it all at once? Why develop each layer of sofrito separately when you could add everything together? Why use specific brands of ingredients when generic versions were cheaper? But gradually he had begun to understand that these inefficiencies were actually sophisticated techniques that produced superior results. The newspaper wants to do a follow-up story about the restaurant. Maria told us during one of our Sunday dinners. They're calling it the most successful comeback in restaurant history. The transformation of Antonino's into Nonna Lucia's had been remarkable. Instead of trying to recreate his stolen reputation, Tony had built something entirely new based on honesty, respect, and authentic technique. The restaurant now served my great-grandmother's complete recipes, properly prepared and honestly credited. But more importantly, it had become a place that honored Italian-American culinary heritage rather than exploiting it. The reservations are booked 3 months out, Tony told me with genuine pride that had nothing to do with ego. But the best part is the letters we get from Italian families who say we're serving food that tastes like their grandmother's cooking. That was the real measure of success. Not food critics praising innovative interpretations, but families recognizing authentic flavors that connected them to their heritage. And the cooking classes? Tony had started offering cooking classes where he taught traditional Italian techniques while sharing the stories behind each recipe. Students learned not just how to make ragu, but why certain techniques had developed, how Italian families had adapted their cooking to American ingredients, and why respect for cultural heritage was essential to authentic cuisine. The classes are always full. People want to learn not just how to cook, but how to understand the cultural context that makes food meaningful. But the most important lesson had been learned by Tony himself. Betty, I need to ask you something. Why did you help me? After everything I said about your family's recipes, after I stole from you and built a business on your heritage, why did you give me a chance to make it right? I had been waiting for this question for months, knowing that Tony needed to understand not just the techniques I had taught him, but the philosophy behind my decision to help rather than simply destroy him. Tony, when my great-grandmother came to America, she could have held on to her recipes as family secrets, never sharing them with anyone outside our bloodline. Instead, she taught other immigrants, helped them feed their families, shared her knowledge because she understood that culture grows stronger when it's shared respectfully, not when it's hoarded. But I didn't share respectfully. I stole. You did steal. But you also gave me the opportunity to teach a lesson that goes beyond just you and your restaurant. What kind of lesson? The lesson that authentic culture can't be stolen or faked. It can only be earned through understanding, respect, and genuine appreciation for the people who created it. Tony's success had become a model for how cultural heritage should be honored in professional kitchens. Other chefs had started acknowledging the sources of their traditional recipes, food magazines had begun featuring stories about family cooking traditions, and culinary schools had started including courses on cultural respect and intellectual property. But the most satisfying outcome had been the impact on my own family. Maria had started learning my great-grandmother's complete recipes, not just the simplified versions I had taught her as a child. Mom, I want to make sure these techniques don't get lost. I want to teach them to my children someday. My grandchildren had become interested in their Italian heritage in ways they never had before. They wanted to hear stories about their great-great-grandmother Lucia, learn traditional cooking methods, and understand how their family's recipes had evolved over generations. Nonna Betty, My grandson asked during a recent cooking lesson, "Why didn't you just let Uncle Tony's restaurant fail after he stole from us?" Because, sweetheart, the best way to preserve something valuable isn't to hide it away where no one can steal it. It's to teach people why it's valuable and how to treat it with respect. The wooden box containing my great-grandmother's complete recipe collection now sat in a place of honor in Nonna Lucia's kitchen, available for any chef who wanted to learn traditional techniques properly. But it was protected by something more powerful than locks or legal contracts. It was protected by the understanding that authentic cuisine requires authentic respect. Tony had learned that lesson the hard way, but he had learned it completely. The man who had once dismissed traditional knowledge as inferior to formal training now spent his days teaching others that the most valuable culinary education comes from understanding and honoring the cultural heritage that gives meaning to every dish. The restaurant that had begun as a monument to arrogance and theft had become a celebration of cultural heritage and authentic technique. Food critics now praised Nonna Lucia's not for innovative interpretations, but for faithful preservation of traditional methods that were in danger of being lost. "Betty," Tony said as we finished preparing the evening's ragu, "I need you to know that learning from you has been the most valuable education I've ever received. Not just about cooking, but about respect, culture, and what authentic really means." "And what does authentic mean to you now?" "Authentic means understanding that great cooking comes from great love, great respect, and great humility. It means recognizing that the knowledge passed down through generations is more valuable than any formal training, and that earning the right to inherit that knowledge is a privilege that should never be taken for granted." As I watched Tony carefully taste the ragu and adjust the seasoning with the intuitive understanding that had taken him 6 months to develop, I realized that my great-grandmother's legacy had grown beyond just feeding families. It had become a teaching tool that helped people understand the difference between stealing culture and honoring it. The recipes that Tony had once dismissed as ethnic nonsense had taught him that authentic cuisine isn't about expensive ingredients or formal training. It's about understanding the love, respect, and cultural pride that transforms simple ingredients into expressions of heritage and family. And perhaps most importantly, they had taught him that the most valuable knowledge can't be stolen from recipe cards or YouTube videos. It can only be earned through humility, dedication, and genuine respect for the people who spent their lives perfecting techniques that no culinary school can teach. The man who had mocked my family's heritage had become its most dedicated protector, and the recipes that he had tried to steal had instead stolen his heart, teaching him that authentic culture is too valuable to exploit and too important to fake. Some lessons are learned through success. The most important ones are learned through failure, humility, and the grace of people who choose to teach rather than simply punish. Tony had learned both, and in doing so, he had helped ensure that my great-grandmother's legacy would continue for generations. Not as stolen goods displayed in trendy restaurants, but as honored traditions passed down with the respect and understanding they had always deserved.